Yo, Animator Mon here, with another review for you. I'm going to be talking about the new film, Fantastic Four. Warning of the spoiler. So I saw this movie recently, and I think I had an interesting reaction to it, because I've seen, here and there what people's reactions were to it before I saw it, and I think the consensus is that it's crap. Which I kind of disagree with. I think it's not as crap as what people might say. I think it's an okay film. There are some things that I absolutely love, but there's also things that make me scratch my head. I want to talk about the good and the bad. First, I want to talk about the bad first. So that we can save the good for last, because that's, good. So we get Ben and Reed as children. And the child actor for Reed is terrible. Like, he says everything so monotonely. It was infuriating. And even more annoying is that the kid who played Ben is pretty good. He's decent. I wouldn't say spectacular, but good. And then him compared to what the kid for Reed is doing, it's like, wow. You couldn't have gotten a better child actor for Reed. I found myself really liking the film. I think, wow, there isn't many problems, at least from what I can tell so far. Until we get about, halfway through, they get their powers, and then they cut to a year later, and that's when I started having some major problems. The pacing in this film, it's good until halfway through, and then it immediately gets all weird and wonky, and they get their powers, and then we immediately cut to, now they all have control of their powers, and it's fine. It's kind of ironic, given that the first Fantastic Four movie, the one in the early 2000s, well, not the first, there was one in the 90s, but the one that counts, the one in the 2000s, that movie was nothing but them discovering and learning to control their powers. And in this one, we completely skipped that part. It completely, and it's so jarring that it really rubbed me the wrong way. Then we have the whole thing with Reed being on the run, and then he's captured, and that goes by so quickly that I have no time to feel anything about this. And then we get the villain who just comes out of nowhere all of a sudden, and it's like, oh, okay, villain. Oh, now the villain's defeated. It goes so quickly. I really think this movie would have benefited from no villain. I mean, no villain in the traditional sense of big bad at the end. Because this is a movie that sort of doesn't really feel like a superhero movie all that much. I think it could have gotten away with something like not having a villain in the end, because it really takes the focus off of a lot of what else is happening. Or maybe the film needs to be longer so that it didn't feel so out of nowhere and rushed. Also, in a few places, especially, again, toward the end, the second half, the dialogue starts to feel a little stiff. It really is just that halfway mark. I'm not even sure if it's halfway or whatever, but the second part of the film. Maybe it's just the third act, actually. It feels really rushed. Everything feels so rushed. And speaking of things that are rushed, some of the characters' sort of arcs, motivations, I think some of those seem a little rushed as well. We don't spend nearly enough time with Ben. That's the point. And I feel like what happens to him later in the film would be much more powerful if we got to know him a bit more. Then we have Victor. His sort of turn to villainy isn't as smooth as I'd like it to be. I mean, it's not terrible, or, well, it's not atrocious, but I think it should have been a bit smoother. Like, the ideas of his ideas transitioning into him, turning him into a villain could have been better. Okay, now on to the good. The first two acts of this movie are, I think, splendid. I think it's fantastic. Seeing Reed and Ben grow up, and then Reed working on this teleporter or whatever, a transdimensional teleporter. All of that is pretty solid. For the most part, it really just feels like an interesting sci-fi movie, which I actually rather like. It doesn't need to necessarily conform to the standards of a superhero film. And for the most part, at least first two acts, it doesn't. It does its own thing. Stuttering like a motherfucker. seeing the progression of just them building and developing this machine is pretty great, and the chemistry between all four of them is pretty good too. You know, with the exception of like Ben and most of the other characters. But that's mostly just because he doesn't interact with the other characters enough. And then we get to when they get their powers and how they deal with that. And right before we get that time skip, it's actually done really, really well. Like, especially love the scene where Reed is crawling through the air vents or whatever, and he sees Ben, and Ben is scared, and he's afraid, and he wants to be helped. He wants to go back to the way things were. That is an especially powerful scene. It would have been more powerful, like I said earlier, if we had spent more time with Ben. The action, for the most part, is fine. It's good. Nothing stellar. As far as how well this is an adaptation of the Fantastic Four, I'm the wrong guy to ask, because I don't really know anything about the Fantastic Four besides what we saw in the last two films. The changes in sort of the dynamic, and especially Victor being his whole thing being changed quite a bit. I'm not especially angry or anything. It's not that big a deal to me. But if you were, I suppose if you were a big Fantastic Four fan, then it might bother you. But if you're not, it's not going to bother you. I think it's Miles Teller who plays Reed Richards. Fantastic job. He does a great job. And so do most of the cast. I think everybody does a great job. There isn't really a bad actor, except for, the kid that plays Reed during the beginning bits. Besides him, everyone does a spot-on job. Everyone does a great job. I think the sort of themes of, government interference are a little heavy-handed, especially with some of the lines Victor has, where it's just so blatant. It could have been a bit more subtle, but I think that's maybe just a minor problem in the grand scheme of things. So, overall, I'd say Fantastic Four is an okay movie. It's really bogged down by terrible pacing issues later in the story. But I don't think it's terrible. I don't think it's awful. I don't think it's horrible. I'd actually be interested to see what a sequel would look like. Maybe? I don't know. Well, catch you on the flip side.